it is a privilege to be with each of you here today. It's been good to see a number of familiar faces as well as some new faces. And if you think we're familiar faces and I don't act like we are, make sure you reintroduce yourself to me. Why don't we pray as we begin? Father in heaven, we thank you so much that we've already been blessed by the fellowship, by the insights that you've shared, just shining light again on your truths from your word and from medical science. We thank you so much that we can look forward to you continuing to be our teacher, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, in my two CME presentations, we will be using the same handout. And just to give you kind of a bird's eye view of where we're headed, first of all, I have no disclosures in this presentation. And we're going to go through a number of objectives in this and the next one. So whatever we don't cover in this, hour and 15 minutes or so that we have, we will attempt to cover Sunday morning. So it's the same handout that we'll be using. And we'll just read through the objectives together just so you know where we're headed. The first one is we're going to look at this technical science of hemorrheology. It's the science of blood fluidity. And we're going to look at a number of disease states that are related. I'm hoping that you'll retain at least 5 of them. You'll be able to make connections between blood fluidity and at least 5 important disease states. Then we're going to talk about how hemorrheology can be used as a framework for ministering to your patients, ministering to your communities, why this is such an integrative concept. Then we're going to look at some practical aspects as we go through certain things that can improve blood fluidity. We're going to talk about how you can impact blood fluidity by things like weight loss and exercise. We're going to talk about some specifics when it comes to certain types of exercise. Resistance exercise is one that we'll look at. And then we're going to talk about some other things that perhaps you've worked on. Those of you that have been in health promotion and health ministry for years, perhaps you have run a 5-day stop smoking plan. It seems like maybe there's not that much demand for it, but I'll tell you, there's still so many people. We, both my wife and I, work with underserved populations as far as health, and still significant prevalence of smoking in the American public. You may be dealing with a more educated populace that don't seem to have that challenge in their lives, but it's still something that there's a need for a lot of help. So practical things we'll talk that connect the dots with another condition. And then we're going to look at some of the use of over-the-counter compounds that may undermine blood fluidity. So we're focused in this series on hemorheology. Hemo, of course, refers to blood, and rheology refers to the science dealing with the flow properties of complex substances, complex matter. Some of you, if you have a civil engineering background, you have studied rheology. If you're looking at sewage disposal, hemorheology, that is our focus. And as we're talking today, I don't know if you've thought about this much, but if you've studied what motivates people to make changes. As physicians, we like to think people are motivated to live longer. In fact, I was just talking with one of my parishioners, and she was telling me that she had this wake-up call just a short while ago. She had had her second bout of COVID, and her doctor told her that she needed to lose weight, or she wasn't going to be around much longer. He wasn't just speaking about infectious diseases, but speaking about overall morbidity and, of course, mortality. And that got her attention. So we like to think, well, that's what, if we can tell people they're going to die sooner, that's going to motivate them. But the research suggests that the things that most motivate people are things that affect how they will look, how they feel, or how they will function. Yes, short-term motivation with imminent demise, but if you've worked with cardiac patients, right, what happens? After a few years, they've avoided cardiovascular death, and they gradually drift back into their old lifestyle. Have you seen that before? So hemorheology, this science not only deals with things that can cut our life short, but definitely with things that can affect how we look, how we feel, and how we function. So if you've already looked on your device for a medical definition of hemorheology, you may have come up with something like this. pretty straightforward. Why is it important? We've been hearing from a, how was it put, 19th century health reformer, or a health reformer of yesteryear. In the book Ministry of Healing, page 293, Ellen White focused us on this first one when she said, perfect health requires a perfect circulation. I mean, I think of people who read this, they may have said, well, this sounds like nice poetry, but this is cutting-edge medical science. So there's whole societies, medical journals devoted to hemorheology and the microcirculation. So we're going to look at a number of areas that improving hemorheology can help us with. And some of these may seem obvious. You could say, well, stroke, sure, that's related to circulation. Coronary artery disease, sure. But what about blindness? What about cancer? Cognitive decline? All of these things can be prevented by improving hemorheology. Complications of diabetes, weight gain, arthritis, age-related physical deterioration, and even suboptimal physical performance among the young and fit. Now, a lot of folks say, well, this is easy. Let's just put the word hemorheology into PubMed or Google Scholar or wherever you like to start your medical searches, and I'll just find all the research on it. Well, the problem is a lot of the research that impacts hemorheology doesn't even use the term. So most studies don't look comprehensively at blood fluidity, but we'll look at a number of factors that impact blood fluidity, and we'll see just how powerful they are. So we're going to kind of give you a quick overview of just the importance of this science. So first we're going to look at just some examples of how important hemorheology is. And the first one actually comes from a journal devoted to the topic, Clinical Hemorheology and Microcirculation. Some years ago, they published a study looking at nearly 300 patients who had evidence for impaired cerebrovascular circulation. So they had either had a stroke or they had had a TIA, transient ischemic attack. They compared them with 73 controls. And what did they find? They found that all these markers of blood fluidity were significant predictors of whether a person would have a stroke or a TIA. So this list is just four commonly looked at factors that impact blood fluidity. So the first one is hematocrit. Now we all intuitively know what hematocrit is, but what is it specifically? Who would like to give me a medical definition of hematocrit? Yeah, it's the percentage of your blood that's made up of red blood cells, right? So if your hematocrit's 55, what does that mean? Yeah, 55% of your blood is made up of red blood cells. And I like to ask trick questions. So what's better, a high hematocrit or a low hematocrit? Yeah, I already told you it's a trick question. Yeah, neither. Too high a hematocrit impairs blood fluidity. That's what they found. Higher hematocrits, more red cells. It's just like, I mean, what do you like better? When you're on the freeways and there's a lot of cars or few? Well, the more vehicles there are, the more impediment? Yeah, it sounds, I'm getting better there. More restrictance, impedance? Yes, that's why I like being married to a physician. Yes, more impedance to flow. So that's the challenge. So high hematocrit is not desirable. And you remember those stories, maybe some of you do, back in, what was it, the 80s, where there was a whole sport that had become preoccupied with boosting hematocrit illegally. Do you remember this? These elite cyclists that were getting these autologous transfusions, they would be, have some health provider that was complicit with them, and they'd have a pint of blood drawn off and stick it in that, of course, mixed with the appropriate preservatives or whatever they have in there to keep it stable for a month or two. Maybe they took off another pint of blood, allowed their body to build up, and then before the race, they got that infusion of their own blood. It was before erythropoietin and other chemical means of stimulating hematocrit. And what happened? Well, they could carry more oxygen. So there was a correlation with performance, but what they paid for, well, the payment, the charge, was poorer hemorheology. And the research suggests, or at least reports suggest, that as many as 20 or more individuals died, either during or immediately after races, because presumably they got somewhat more dehydrated during the heat of the race. And then that hemorrheology was so impaired that they ended up with a terminal event, whether it was cardiac or cerebral. So hematocrit, very, very important as far as a determinant of blood fluidity. Now, of course, you might think it's great to have few cars on the road if you're traveling, but why do we not want a low hematocrit? Yeah, basic question, right? You need adequate hematocrit, you need adequate red cells, adequate hemoglobin to carry oxygen, right? So too low is bad, too high is bad. What about plasma viscosity? Well, what have we got here? I always like demonstrations, and there's something that I always long for when I'm speaking. Those of you that are presenters, you know this. One of the most challenging things you have when you're up front is, well, I won't say what it is, but I just want you to be very observant right now. Let me ask you a question then. What did you just see? You saw a man drinking water, yes, very astute. How quickly did the water go down? Quickly, right? So does water have high viscosity or low viscosity? Yeah, it's low. So how about if that was honey? Would that have gone down as quickly? No. Or even oil. So the lower the viscosity, the better as far as hemorheology. Then you have fibrinogen, that clotting protein. Higher fibrinogen levels worsen blood fluidity. And then the tendency of your red cells to aggregate. If your red cells tend to clump together more, how is that going to impact blood fluidity? Yeah, it's going to worsen it. It's going to worsen it. So all of these things here in the research are markers of hemorheology, and the worse those markers, the greater the risk of stroke or TIA. And you say, okay, well, that's pretty obvious, right? I mean, we learned this early on. I mean, even if you're not a health professional, you know that brain circulation is related to stroke. Just how important are these factors? Well, let's look at another example, and that's coronary artery disease. And just look at the impact of hemorheology. How much do these factors make a difference? This is a European study, and again, this is not like some esoteric science that's just coming out yesterday. I mean, the literature is replete with research on this, and to me, it's interesting that I hear so few people talk about this science. And in fact, when I speak to lay audiences, I say, how many of you are disappointed to learn that this is just going to be another talk on hemorheology? And I usually get blank stares. So it's not like this is part of the vernacular, but it should be. So you look here, this is looking at quintiles. It's dividing the population into fifths. And you see if you compare the lowest fifth of the population, those are the ones with the best values when it comes to fibrinogen and viscosity in those first two columns, you see that you're talking about a fourfold difference in relative risk of a major ischemic heart event if you have worse hemorheology markers in terms of fibrinogen and viscosity. Now here's the other interesting one, white cell count. The higher your white cell count, the poorer your blood fluidity. It was not long ago. I mean, it was the last few weeks. I mean, this is kind of a recurring dialogue that I have. I got a call on this same topic probably 10, 15 years ago from a pastor. He called me. He said, Dr. DeRose, I was just in to see my doctor, and he's telling me I got to eat red meat. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, my white count was low. My white count was low. And I said, well, you don't need to eat red meat. I know a much better way to raise your white count than eating red meat. And he said, what? What is it? I said, start smoking cigarettes. And he said, like, what? Well, here's my point. The illustration I like are white blood cells are like the police cars in your body. Now, how many of you are reassured to have some police cars in your community? Is that somewhat reassuring to you? Okay. How many of you drove to this venue? Okay, I see a number of you. So paint a picture for you. You're going home. as you're getting closer to home, you start seeing more and more police cars. How many of you are thinking, I'm encouraged to see them ramping up police protection in my community? How many of you are thinking that? How about as you pull up to your house, if you see 5 squad cars in your driveway? How many of you are saying, well, this is wonderful. I'm glad. I mean, I was worried maybe someone would rob me while I was gone, but look, the police are right here at my house. How many of you are getting excited about it? You say, no way, this is a bad sign. So I try to get people to think in terms of white cells as being the police cars. If you've got a healthy body, how many defenders do you need? You need far fewer. So Jim, I don't know if you measure CBC when people come into your program and when they leave, but invariably when people come to a comprehensive lifestyle program, they come in with a white count of 7.5, can almost guarantee it's going to be 5.5 or lower when they leave. Okay? So people that get on healthier lifestyles have lower white counts. And if your patients take to heart what Dr. Schwelt's going to share with us on Sunday, and they get rid of the red meat, you know what's going to happen to their white count? It's going to go down, okay? And they get rid, so the healthier your lifestyle, the lower your white count. Now, of course, could you say, could I be developing some kind of, marrow failure, or do I have neutropenia for some other reason? Well, I mean, sure, it could happen, but if you've looked at this pastor that I was talking with some years ago, and this patient that I was talking with recently, their white count it hadn't changed. But some people, when they see that, they say, this is not normal. Well, here's the thing. One of the things that white count is, it's a marker for poor blood fluidity. You don't want more white cells. You don't want more white cells. But look at the magnitude of risk when it comes to heart disease. Here's an interesting aside for you. You were hearing about circadian rhythms already, and circadian rhythms, of course, the most powerful, actually we use a German term in the chronobiology literature. It's Zeitgeber. It literally means time giver. And the most powerful time giver is the sun, okay? So that's helping to synchronize our circadian rhythm. But there's other things that can be Zeitgebers, can synchronize our circadian rhythms. But bottom line is, no matter what you do, you can try to mitigate. You can say, you know what, I'm going to throw away that lecture. By the way, we really enjoyed that lecture, Roger. Thanks so much for that. But we're going to throw that away because we didn't like the conclusions. And I'm just going to do some other tricks to try to get my circadian rhythm, firing at my SCN, stimulated by other. Look, here's the point. Here's the point. If you look at just how powerful the sun is, and you look at what happens to circadian rhythms with our cardiac cycle, you've seen this, many of you. Early morning hours, highest risk of heart attacks. And it's interesting, as you look at this, what do you know about blood fluidity that's related to circadian rhythms? Well, it just so happens that how much activity do you do during the nighttime hours? When you get up, how much water have you been drinking? I mean, there's a number of things. So basically, your blood fluidity tends to be worse early in the day, and that's when heart attacks peak. Just an interesting aside there. Well, we've talked about some things that can kill you or cripple you. I've said things that motivate health behavior change are things that affect how we look, how we feel, how we function. But what about blindness? How would that be related to blood fluidity? Now, that's not as intuitive for me, heart attack, stroke. But if you look at the literature on 2 of the leading causes of blindness, by the way, what is the leading cause of blindness in adults in America? That's right, it's diabetes. But 2 of the other big causes are macular degeneration and glaucoma. And if you look at the research, what you're going to find is as you look at either one, you're going to find there's a compelling connection between hemorrheology factors and glaucoma as well as macular degeneration. So this is looking at age-related macular degeneration. And what you see is you look at these same things, plasma viscosity, fibrinogen. Here's another marker of blood fluidity, von Willebrand factor. And you can see the worse they are, what do you have? A greater risk of age-related macular degeneration. What about glaucoma? It looks like they just copied the same studies. It's the same conclusions. What? Viscosity, hematocrit, fibrinogen, erythrocyte aggregation. And so you see these hemorheology, these microcirculation determining factors that are impacting not just things that can kill us or cripple us. I haven't known of anyone who actually died from blindness. If I ask an audience that, they'll say, oh yeah, I heard about this person who, walked out in the middle of the road because they couldn't see. Well, believe me, the death certificate didn't say blindness. Okay, what did the death certificate say? Yeah. Okay, yeah, motor vehicle accident or whatever, or trauma. Okay, what about cancer? Now this really starts to push the envelope as far as, just kind of my sense of what circulation impacts. Cancer? Why a connection with cancer? And again, we're just touching on this, but I want you to be able to leave with at least a connection with 5 of these things. I'm going to give you more than 5, but my goal is that you'll say, this is really important stuff. If you haven't had hemorheology, blood fluidity on your radar screen as far as motivating your patients, motivating your community, motivating yourself, I want it to be on your radar screen. Why does it have a connection with cancer? Well, this was a review about a decade ago that looked at hemorheologic factors and relationship to cancer. You can see there's relationships with primary cancers as well as to metastatic cancer. Well, the metastatic cancer may be a little bit easier to understand. So this is a study looking at gynecologic cancer patients. And the first observation in this study where they measured, and you can see what they measured, plasma viscosity. They also measured some other hemorheologic markers, but plasma viscosity in particular, these women undergoing surgery, and they found, big yawn, right, that those women had a greater risk of having thromboses, clots in their veins after surgery. Any surprise? We say no, this is obvious. But here's what they also found. Viscosity was a significant factor in overall survival for ovarian cancer patients. So you say well, why would that be? Why would it be a risk factor or an indicator for survival? And here's what the authors concluded. This was their conjecture at least. What is the mechanism that they're postulating? So in gynecologic cancer patients, the combination of an increase in RBC aggregation and plasma viscosity. So we're basically worsened hemorheology. These 2 markers are going to do what? Obviously, it's going to impair blood flow properties. And then what is that going to do? It's going to introduce or increase or induce hypoxia, so lower oxygen levels in the microcirculation. And what is that going to do? It's going to favor microthrombi, tiny little clots. And when tumor cells are migrating from the cancer, the theory is they can lodge in those clots relatively isolated for a short period of time from the circulation and can set up foothold and develop metastases. Is that a compelling explanation to you? Perhaps. Maybe not. Well, there's other things that relate to blood fluidity that also connect with cancer metastasis, and the platelet and platelet stickiness, platelet aggregability is another common denominator. So this science goes way back, and talking about a number of factors related to the platelet, and let's just read this slide here. So Judah Folkman proposed that tumor growth is dependent on angiogenesis. This is not surprising to many of you. Platelets, though, store various angiogenesis regulating factors. Most of these angiogenic agents have been shown to participate in angiogenesis for tumor growth directly or indirectly. Okay, fair enough. It is suggested that platelets have a role in the sequestration, adherence, and penetration of tumor cells through the blood vessel endothelial cell barrier, thus preventing their rapid clearance from the circulation and allowing extravascular formation of nests of cells. Very interesting. What happens is the platelets can actually clump onto tumor cells that have left the tumor, and they can actually sequester or hide the tumor from the immune system. Some years ago, my wife and I were helping with a lifestyle program in the Czech Republic. And they told us, oh, this is a fascinating area. This is, during communism, the USSR had a secret base here in what's now the Czech Republic. And they said, it's out in the woods out there. So, of course, enjoying the opportunity to get out and get some exercise, we were exploring, trying to find this secret, well, then secret, not secret anymore, this bunker. And we're out in the woods looking, and there was nothing out there. It was just woods and grass. And then we found it. On the side of a hill, there was the entrance to this vast complex, but it was totally covered. If you went from above, if there's aerial surveillance, satellite surveillance, all you would see is woods and grass. So basically, the natural things that belong there were surrounding these invaders in the Czechs' homeland. Well, it's the same with the platelet. The platelet, this natural, self can surround the cancer cell and can allow it to grab a foothold. Observations have suggested that platelets not only augment the growth of primary tumors via angiogenesis, but endow tumor cells physical and mechanical support to evade the immune system and extravasate to secondary organs, the basis of metastatic disease. So again, I'm just trying to touch on some things that connect things that are related to blood fluidity and circulation through some different mechanisms here. In this case, not just direct circulatory mechanisms, but things that all affect blood fluidity. Well, I'm going to skip on to this one for you, cognitive decline. And cognitive decline, of course, is something that is a compelling concern to our aging population. And we're going to talk here a little bit about connections between the development of cognitive impairment and hemorrheology. So this is a more recent study. It's called the REGARDS study. And they looked at this sample, a biracial sample, black and white individuals. And you can see it's a relatively short study, 3.5 years. Individuals greater than or equal to 45 years of age. And you can see no baseline cognitive impairment, no history of stroke. And what happened? They looked for those who developed significant cognitive changes during the course of the study based on standard cognitive testing. And what did they find? Well, they found the worse your hemorheology, the greater your risk of cognitive decline. And it was looking at, again, some of the same things we've been talking about, some other markers as well. So fibrinogen, you've heard about that. Now you see factor 8 listed, and D-dimer, which is a marker, of course, of thrombosis. So, okay, mental health and the Methuselah Factor. Sometimes I call it the Methuselah Factor. And the reason I use that terminology, I found early on when speaking about this to audiences, lay audiences, I mean, you folks, most of you are medical professionals, and you don't have a problem remembering hemorheology. But one of my great fears as a teacher is that you'll spend an hour or more talking with someone about something, and they'll leave, and they'll be excited about it. And they might say, oh, you wouldn't believe what I learned. I went to this presentation at the Seventh-day Adventist church in... what church do you represent? Someone give me a church. Someone say they're from Brewster? Did I hear that name? Okay, so I went to the Seventh-day Adventist church in Brewster, and I heard this amazing talk. Well, what was it about? It was about that'd be embarrassing, right? So for lay audiences, we've been calling it for years the Methuselah Factor. And we all know that Methuselah was the individual who was, according to Scripture, lived the longest on planet Earth, right? Do I have that straight? I mean, you got to be careful how you say this, because, Enoch never died, right? So, but Methuselah lived the longest on planet Earth. I'm saying that correctly, aren't I? Good. I need all the help I can get. So Methuselah lived the longest on planet Earth. How much data do we have on Methuselah's hemorheologic markers. Do we have any results of his fibrinogen levels or von Willebrand factor, platelet? We have anything like this on him? No, nothing. But can we be quite confident that he had excellent hemorheology? I'm convinced he had great blood fluidity. So I like to call it the Methuselah Factor. If you look at hematocrit, we already talked about hematocrit, remember? High hematocrits, undesirable for blood fluidity. Low hematocrits, undesirable for what? Yeah, can't carry enough oxygen. If you do a choice response time test, you're in a lab, they say, you know, when you see the blue circle hit the particular key, you know, depending, they might be on a pad, it maybe, you know, hit the space bar or whatever. And so you got to see how quickly you can respond when they show you an image. I see some of you kind of, you say, I'm not describing that very well. We'll just do it for you right now, okay? We'll give you a choice response time test. Are you ready? So I'm going to say the name of a color. And as soon as I say the name of a color, I want you to raise your right hand. Are you ready? Fire truck. Okay, well, that's not a color. Okay, yellow. Okay, so who had the best choice response time? I mean, I'm not asking for an individual. Yeah, whoever raised their hand first, right? So the lower the number, the better. Following along? So take a look at this graph with that in mind. So what you see is if you're anemic, yes, your choice response time will be poorer. But once you get into a hematocrit of what, around 46, 47, that's actually going to be optimal. And then as your hematocrit goes up, it gets worse. So, what about viscosity? The lower your viscosity, the better the cognitive function. So I'm glad they've got water back there. By the way, exercise is good for your blood fluidity. So don't hesitate. You have perfect permission to get up and walk. You know, walk back, get some water. And my understanding is that does not impact your ability to claim this for CME. That counts, okay? And by the way, we'll find out, I know, much to the delight of Dr. Schwelt, that sleep also is a good thing on this topic. So you also have permission to sleep during my lectures, but not during Roger's, okay? So lower plasma viscosity improves reaction speed. And what about venesection? Oh, this is fascinating. We'll talk about one of the things you can do to improve your blood fluidity. Believe it or not, many Americans may benefit themselves more than their communities by donating blood. Yeah, donating blood. We'll talk more about that. High blood pressure, is it impacted by hemorheology? Well, there's a number of ways it's impacted. So, the worse your hemorheology, the worse your blood fluidity, the greater the resistance is to blood flow, and what happens? I mean, this is just, you just think mechanisms, it's going to take more force to circulate your blood. Well, if your hemorheology is not as good, if you're not getting as much oxygen to the microcirculation, what happens? Your endothelial cells, the cells lining the blood vessels, are not as healthy. Those lining cells, if they're healthy and they're getting adequate oxygen, will produce nitric oxide, which helps to relax or dilate those blood vessels. If they're not dilating, they're what? Well, they're relatively constricted. All of those things contribute. So here's a schematic. And you can see there's some other things on here. You can see that there's going to be decreased insulin delivery to tissue. Some of you may remember, we're going to talk some about hydrotherapy. We may touch on this. But actually, just heating the body will improve insulin delivery and can actually lower blood sugar levels. Decreased insulin delivery to tissue, though, if your microvasculature is compromised. Decreased tissue oxygenation, you can see here some of the things we talked about, as well as increasing insulin resistance. So let's take a look here. This is a quote. increase in blood viscosity, platelet activation, or both, is presumed to play a part in the pathogenesis of hypertension. So you can look more at some of the research we put there, but I'm just trying to underscore just how critical this science is. So we really want to optimize blood fluidity, whether we're talking about killer diseases or whether we're talking about diseases like high blood pressure that clearly is associated not only with mortality from things like stroke and heart attack, but you're all aware, aren't you, that hypertension is a leading risk factor for dementia, cognitive decline, right? So if you're concerned about maintaining your brain health, you have to be concerned about your blood pressure. So just a number of other connections between things that impact blood fluidity and blood pressure. What about diabetes and its complications? Are there connections there with blood fluidity? You say, well, we already saw that graphic, and we put that up there for you. Again, poor blood fluidity, connections with insulin resistance. And we probably should just pause here because I think many of you that work with the public, whether it's in your practices, whether it's in health education efforts, whether you've done health events for your community, you've talked about insulin resistance, right? It's something that's modifiable with lifestyle. And insulin resistance is, of course, the root cause of type 2 diabetes, right? I mean, if you look at, the person you just diagnosed with diabetes and you do an immunoreactive insulin level, or you do a C-peptide level, these different markers of how much insulin they're making, and what do you find out often? They have low insulin levels? They have high insulin levels, right? And that's typically we see early in the course of type 2 diabetes, their insulin levels are actually elevated. Well, how could that be? It's because their tissues are not responding to it optimally. They have insulin resistance. And one of the things that impacts insulin resistance is blood fluidity. And you can see here, it's not a chicken or egg question. It is a relationship that goes both ways. So insulin resistance actually impairs hemorrheology, and poor hemorrheology actually worsens insulin resistance. And we have some slides that go through some of the literature on this, but again, this graphic I think is especially helpful if you're trying to conceptualize why blood fluidity is so important when it comes to the things that we deal with day in and day out as healthcare providers, right? And if you can catch this and you can communicate it to your patients, you say, well, communicate this to our patients. How do we do that in a short visit? Well, we'll talk about some of these things, hopefully before we finish this series of presentations today and tomorrow. Let's just talk a little bit more just to try to make this concrete for us. So first of all, inflammatory processes. So we're going to hear more about this when it comes to diet and especially meat tomorrow. I'm glad, not tomorrow, it's Sunday, right, Roger? Got it, Sunday? Okay. So, but anyway, we're going to talk about inflammatory processes, and one of the things that impacts inflammatory processes, of course, is diet, but it's also weight, even if you're on the ideal diet. And you're carrying extra adipose cell mass, basically adipocytes or adipocytes, depending on what side of the Atlantic you prefer the pronunciation. What are they? These are metabolically active cells, and they're producing pro-inflammatory compounds. And those pro-inflammatory compounds, among the things they do is they worsen blood fluidity. They raise white count. They raise fibrinogen. And those are some of the factors that actually worsen insulin resistance. And we won't speak a lot about it, but of course, insulin resistance is not just related to diabetes. There's people that never develop diabetes. We talk a lot today in public health about pre-diabetes. Many of you are aware pre-diabetes is a risk factor for circulatory events, both stroke and heart attacks. Insulin resistance, increased insulin resistance associated with increased cancer risk, a number of cancers connected, prostate cancer being one of them. It's connected to a major cause of infertility, polycystic ovary syndrome. So as we're talking about, blood fluidity, it impacts a huge number of things that we're dealing with. So, as clinicians, we're always asking what? What is that teachable moment? When can I, share something with a patient that's going to motivate them? And it's amazing. What is it that motivates patients? You think this is very motivating, and they kind of sigh, they yawn, whatever. And I remember hearing a story years ago. They had a big event talking about the harms of tobacco smoking. And they had the researchers coming up speaking about heart disease risk and cancer. And there was some actor who was the MC for the event, and he's listening to all this. And then they had a dermatologist come up. And he talked about how smoking increased the aging of the skin and wrinkling. And he was visibly shaken, the MC. And he said, I'm going to really have to seriously think about this smoking. Again, this is something that affected how he looked, okay? So those are often the most motivating things. So we think we're giving this powerful information. You're going to die early. That doesn't always motivate people. You see, I know that, right? Because I've been telling my patient this for years, and they keep doing it. But if you can make these connections, maybe it's, they're dealing with infertility. It's a younger patient. Maybe it's dealing with mental performance or physical performance. So we'll try to make all those connections with blood fluidity. So as insulin levels go up in the body, one of the things that happens is red blood cells tend to clump together more. So it's another way that blood fluidity is impacted by diabetes in particular, but insulin resistance in and of itself worsens red cell, or increases red cell aggregation. And you can see here a number of the things that are all impacted by insulin resistance: higher viscosity, elevated fibrinogen, increased hematocrit. This is how some researchers summarized it. Increased blood viscosity adversely affects the microcirculation in diabetes, leading to microangiopathy. And that, of course, is what lies at the root of some of the complications that are most feared with diabetes. And often these things affect what? They affect how we look, how we feel, how we function, right? Whether you're talking about diabetic changes to the eye, right? It's related to microangiopathy. Whether you talk about diabetic changes to the nerves, diabetic neuropathy, right? How many of you have had patients who couldn't work because of their neuropathy? You've seen them, right? We've had patients with amputations, right, because of their microangiopathy from diabetes. And so these things affect how they look, how they feel, how they function, and blood fluidity. So if we can get this idea that if we can improve circulatory health, and we kind of cast this vision of people, and we make it understandable, and we'll try to do that in this series of presentations. So here's another quote. If this isn't coming together for you, I'm sure it is, because I see you tracking along. Rheological factors and increased platelet aggregation are convincingly implicated in the development of micro and macrovascular disease associated with diabetes. So if you really want to impact diabetes and its complications, you have to affect circulation. And there's all kinds of things that have been studied over and this is not, I'm surprised at how little we hear about this topic. This is 20 years ago. How a vegan diet impacts hemorrheology. Let's talk about weight gain. So a single study to illustrate this is from the journal Obesity Research. They recruited, you can see here, over 13,000 individuals, men and women. They had 45 to 64-year age range. Again, relatively short study, followed them for just 3 years, and they looked to see if you measured markers of hemorrheology, are they more likely to gain weight? So is blood fluidity related to weight gain? And what did they find out? Indeed, you are much more likely to have significant weight gain if you had worse blood fluidity based on a number of markers. So whether you looked at fibrinogen or white cell count or factor VIII or von Willebrand factor, greater likelihood of gaining a significant amount of weight. And so this is kind of a similar slide to the one that you saw. But again, we're looking here at, you decrease tissue oxygenation, slower metabolism, less aerobic, more anaerobic metabolism, so you're burning less calories, and some of the possible pathways to weight gain. So, hopefully, the conclusion is clear, right? Optimal hemorheology is important, and we want to talk about improving blood fluidity. We could have talked about some other areas. I will tell you, and if some of these things are especially important, you let me know, and I can give you some references for it. But really interesting data on blood fluidity in athletes, and especially, we'll touch on some of this as we go along, but even if you would think someone's got to have good hemorheology, I mean, how could you be an athlete and not have good blood fluidity? Well, they actually you look at athletes, their muscular strength, their performance, measurably better the better their blood fluidity is. Okay, so let's talk now a bit about this, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow as well. We're going to look at practical things, simple things that you can do to improve blood fluidity. How can you use this material? Because you say, well, yeah, we're talking about it, sounds important, but how do we communicate this to patients? What can we do to help patients improve their blood fluidity? What can we do as Bible workers, as pastors, as lay people involved in health ministry in our churches? So one of the things that we released recently as a resource is we have a new website called Timeless Healing Insights, and you can actually access the radio show there too that Jim was referring to. But Timeless Healing Insights, we've automated a free 30-day program that we call 30 Days to Better Health. It's a free online lifestyle program. So about short 6-minute videos each day, just kind of simple, no-frills videos, trying to keep them short for the generation that Dr. Schwelt was referring to, who wants, quick things. I will be honest, though. The average person does not want a 30-day program either. You size that up, right? They just want the 3-minute video that tells them how to naturally control, the 10 things I need to do to naturally control blood pressure or diabetes or avoid amputation or stave off dementia. But we've put this in the form of a program that you can use at churches. So we have a 1-hour component that can be used weekly, can be shown in a church, or you who are health professionals could do something in place of it. And it's especially branded to address high blood pressure and diabetes. But we use these concepts that we're going to be talking about in these presentations that relate to improving blood fluidity throughout each of the 30 daily presentations. So the nice thing, so we're working with some IT folks who've helped us automate it. So if someone signs up for the program, they can opt in, they can get a daily email reminder every day to watch the 6-minute video. And we've been referring our patients to it. We've used it in my local church as a platform for a community outreach. So that's another resource for you that uses this. Okay? Yeah, so basically, like I mentioned, people opt in for the daily email reminders, and it sends them a reminder each day. So you can print this chart out if you would like. It's free through that resource. This is a checklist of the different daily challenges. So every day there's a different daily challenge, and these challenges are designed to help people improve their blood fluidity, and we're especially tailoring that free program to high blood pressure and diabetes. And you can see, if you can, brought your field glasses with you, you can see things that are illustrated up there. Everything from diverse to eating beans daily to getting a certain amount of exercise per day. We're letting people set their own goals, but they're to track their progress on a daily basis throughout the 30-day program. So this is blowing up the graphic. You can see we challenge people to measure certain parameters. You can see we're encouraging people to think about blood donation, getting a certain amount of exercise on a weekly basis. I do recommend daily exercise as optimal, and I think you all connected the dots. The best place to get exercise is where? Outdoors, yeah, outdoors, okay? By the way, there's special counsel that encourages useful outdoor exercise, okay? Don't forget that. Social support, social connectedness. By the way, let me just pause here, and we'll talk more about this as we go through this weekend, I'm sure. I don't think most of our churches realize what a powerful resource you have in your church community. Especially having gone through the pandemic, one of the things that has been, really put at a special premium is social connectedness, right? One of the things that's taken a special hit in many respects. And you have a church. You represent a church. You are a member of a church that is actually a place in your community where not only are people coming together, but you're reinforcing these healthy lifestyles. This is incredibly powerful. And having attended public health meetings for literally decades, one of the big themes in public health today has to do with social capital and healthy communities, okay? And looking at community resources, your church is a powerful community resource. So you don't have to apologize. So if you have me lecturing in your church, I may well say something during the presentation. I say, you need to keep doing some of these things. You need to find in your community a group of people who are doing the kind of things we're talking about here. Well, wait a minute. Where are we? We're in a church. And look around you. If you don't know some of these people here, make friends with them. Really, you have a powerful health-giving agency when you identify with a local church congregation. Okay, so we're going to try to cover these other 4 objectives now in the material that I'll begin presenting today and continue presenting tomorrow. We'll try to give you ample time to interact, and we'll start doing that here in a little bit. Sunday, yes, my wife keeps correcting my misspeaking because I want to fast forward, but we don't want to skip the Sabbath. We got some powerful stuff that's going on there. So let's look at 10 strategies to improve your hemorheology, your blood fluidity. So the first one I mentioned already is donating blood. I don't think I threw these slides in here, but let me talk about the ones that are there, and then I'll mention something else to you. So there's some really interesting research that's coming together looking at benefits of blood donation. It's not a huge body of literature, but for many individuals, we have, and Dr. Schwelt may talk about this, we have higher iron levels than optimal. Do you get into that about your red meat topic? Okay, so we'll hear more about it. And even several decades ago, Finnish researchers looked at these connections, and they literally mapped a linear relationship between serum ferritin, which is a marker of iron stores, and cardiovascular risk. So there seems to be a number of benefits with blood donation. This is an interesting study from Europe. In this particular study, they looked at individuals who are regular blood donors. By that, donating 4 times a year, and they compared them with non-blood donors. What they found on average, blood pressure values of something like 12 points systolic and 7 points diastolic lower in the blood donors that didn't seem to be explained by other factors. So blood donation, which improves hemorheology, lowers iron stores, a number of things. It's interesting as we're looking at this science. Well, the other one that might be obvious to you is, let's just pause there at this one here. So a few years ago, as we were working with communities and churches talking about blood fluidity, we said, let's just do a little kind of informal study, and we'll speak on this topic, and we'll see if it changes people's attitudes about blood donation. Just sharing this information. And so what do you think? Do you think it impacted people? Yeah, it's kind of hard to know. It's a big step, to donate blood. It was I was shocked at how motivated people were to donate blood. So just a month ago, I was working with a church in Arkansas, and we actually partnered with the Arkansas Blood Institute. And they helped to publicize this church-sponsored event, because one of the things we were talking about is how blood donation can have some favorable, there's some evidence that it might give us some favorable health benefits for ourselves, not just for our community. So, and I mention this to you because we talk about ways to improve the health of our communities. Think about ways that the messaging that we're giving can draw in other partners. In Ellen White's day, she was a big advocate of the WCTU. Do you remember reading about that? The Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she was encouraging us to partner with other people in that era that were interested in the community's health and healthy lifestyles. In that particular instance, of course, dealing with alcoholic beverages. But I would say, be thinking as you're hearing about the benefits of sunshine, avoiding red meat, some of these things, who might be partners in your community? And some of you are already doing this. I know you're partnering with people, but think about that. Drinking more water. Some of you know Dr. Jacqueline Chan, who was the lead investigator in this study, published now many years ago. I'm still surprised at how many Seventh-day Adventists haven't seen a lot of the basic conclusions that have been drawn from the various iterations of the Adventist health study. So I remember talking with Jackie when shortly after the study came out, and she was saying, her colleagues didn't think this was going to show much. To look at water consumption and risk of fatal heart attacks. So this is the Adventist mortality study before the, current longitudinal study that's going on, Adventist health study. And it was pretty compelling, right? You're looking here at nearly what? Roughly cutting the risk of fatal heart disease in half. And how much water difference was there in these categorization? How much difference was there? I mean, really just a few glasses. So the worst, these are Seventh-day Adventists. There were Seventh-day Adventists in that Adventist mortality study who were not even drinking 2 glasses of water a day. And the big water drinkers in this stratification were more than 5. So even at these lower levels, you can see this very interesting relationship. And then researchers didn't stop just with looking at water drinking. They said, what about other fluids? Because you know how it works, right? You tell your patient to drink more water, and what do they say? Well, I drink 2 6-packs of Pepsi, a day. I mean, that's how I get my water. The water out of the tap tastes terrible. I actually work with a population of patients that the water is pretty bad. I don't know that I'd drink the water out of that tap. And so they're drinking their Pepsi, some of them. But does that help to decrease cardiovascular risk? Well, they found the opposite. The more you drank of this is, of course, population-wide study, so it's looking at things that are commonly consumed. Someone says, well, does this include red clover tea? Well, I don't think there were huge numbers of people drinking red clover tea or hibiscus tea. I mean, what kind of beverages, even as a cross-section of Adventists looking at? As a pastor, I go into people's homes too. And sometimes it's shocking what you see in people's homes, especially when they're trying to improve their lifestyle. And, you have to be very discreet how you try to help them when you've seen, remember being in one person's home and they just had, cases of soft drinks there, and they were, dealing with health issues. This is an interesting one. So we're speaking about blood fluidity. We're speaking about these, various connections. We're speaking about how it's especially powerful to connect these things with affect how people look, how they feel, how they function. And weight loss clearly, transcends all those variables, right? People say, well, if I just weighed less, it would be, be so much easier to get around. It affects how I function. It affects how I look, affects how I feel. People are very motivated generally to lose weight. Well, what do we find? We found that actually, I'm not part of this research study, but it's interesting. Pure water actually has a metabolic stimulating effect, but it's only with pure water. So when you put all kinds of other things into the water, it has something to do with the osmolality of the water. somehow seeming to have this metabolic stimulation. The researchers said it increased thermogenesis by drinking pure water. Well, I told you that in the objectives, we're going to try to look at some over-the-counter compounds that are deleterious to hemorheology. And probably one of the public enemies on the top of the list is caffeine, right? And Dr. Schwelt already laid out a compelling case for why people need caffeine. Why do they reach for it? Why were there 30 people in line there at the Starbucks at the airport early on? What were they trying to do? Yeah, they're trying to wake up. And so how does caffeine work? Well, and how does it impact your blood fluidity? I mean, we've all said, well, caffeine has diuretic effects. Well, if you look at the medical science, a lot of people, minimize that and say, oh, it's not all that significant, those diuretic effects. And especially if you're a regular caffeine user. This should reassure you, if you're a regular caffeine user, that you've gotten used to it. It doesn't seem to have, not really big diuretic effects. By the way, this is really interesting. Jim mentioned the work we've done on high blood pressure, especially reaching out to the public. And a lot of the lifestyle factors that impact blood pressure are very underwhelming if you look at them in isolation, okay? One review of caffeine, for example, suggested that, if on a population-wide basis, habitual caffeine users stop their caffeine, it would lower blood pressure maybe 4 points systolic and 2 points diastolic. And if you share that with your patients, what will they do? Yeah, they'll likely yawn, right? like big, my pressure is 175 over 120. I mean, it's not good. 4 points? Why would I even change? But the problem is, what are we talking about? And I so appreciate Dr. Schwelt's emphasis. We're not just talking about one factor. We're not just talking about diet. We're talking about what? It's a comprehensive lifestyle. And how many domains can you divide a comprehensive lifestyle in? Let's just say, when we did our work on blood pressure, we divided it into 10 domains. So take 10 domains and just say, in each of those 10 domains, you lowered blood pressure maybe just 2 or 3 points. How much would that improve your blood pressure cumulatively? Yeah, 20 or 30 points, okay? So we tend, so researchers of, this is minimal. And in fact, I often tell my patients this. I often say, the problem is with lifestyle, most people have heard enough about lifestyle to make them a bit miserable, but not enough to see any change. And this is the value. A number of you here, were talking with me even beforehand, or I know you from other settings. You've run comprehensive programs like CHIP programs. Some of you run lifestyle programs, live-in programs. Why are they so powerful? Because people are changing multiple things at the same time, and they see more than multiplicative benefits, right? They see exponential benefits. Really? So don't minimize this diuretic effect, but I would suggest to you that caffeine has something worse going for it than its diuretic effects, and that has to do with why those people were in line at the airport. They actually were in line at the airport because they were trying to block adenosine. Now, if you actually surveyed them, they wouldn't have said that likely. Even if they knew the physiology at 6 in the morning, having been up since midnight or 1 or whatever it was, they probably wouldn't have even remembered that. But these adenosine receptors, pervasive throughout the body, and caffeine is very effective at blocking adenosine. And adenosine is very good when it comes to hemorheology. What does it do for you? It helps to relax your blood vessels. It makes your platelets less sticky. It lowers stress hormone levels. Is that good or bad? Be careful. Be careful. I told you I like trick questions, right? Is lowering stress hormones good or bad? Well, at 6 in the morning, if you didn't have enough sleep, lowering stress hormones is perceived to be bad. You want to ramp up your stress hormones, okay? Because you're afraid you're going to sleep in the airport, like someone I knew, and they missed their flight. But if you ramp up your stress hormones, what happens? Yeah, you're more alert. So yes, they're blocking adenosine, and it's doing some bad things for their circulation, but it's waking them up. And in return, their platelets are more sticky. Yes, their stress hormones are up. They think that's good at the time. Their blood pressure's going up. Their blood sugar's going up. So caffeine really undermines a lot of the things that you're trying to help your patients address. It is really not their friend. And I don't know why someone was talking with me the other day about headaches. We were doing a health event at my church, and they came up and asked me about headaches. You know that many people have chronic headaches because of chronic caffeine use. So caffeine has this interesting relationship. It can treat a headache, right? Especially vascular headaches. You know this connection, right? So when you have that aura, that initial warning, what's going on? There's relative vasoconstriction. And then when you have the headache, you have relative vasodilation. And what can treat that? Well, caffeine can treat it. But if you become habituated to caffeine, then when the caffeine level goes down, what happens? It triggers the headache. So, and many of you have seen this, like I have. You have your patient get off the caffeine. Yeah, they have headaches. The headaches get worse, maybe for 5 days or something. And then I've had patients, their headaches gone by getting rid of the caffeine. So, interesting relationships. So, you'll hear, I think, more about some of these things, perhaps, throughout this week together. What about alcohol? It's interesting to me that there are people touting alcohol for blood fluidity. Have you heard this? It's good for your circulation. I don't know that I put all this in your handout. Timothy Key and Margaret Thorogood years ago with the Oxford Vegetarian Study, which is a part of EPIC, the European Perspective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition. They looked at vegetarians in England. Presumably not well represented among Seventh-day Adventists. If you've been to the UK, we don't have a large Adventist population there. And so you're looking at vegetarians. What did they find when it came to alcohol consumption and cardiovascular risk? How much benefit did vegetarians get when they consumed alcohol? 0. No benefit. So my soundbite conclusion is yes, there's some data suggesting that alcoholic beverages may improve circulatory health in some people, but they're only people on a lousy lifestyle, people that are on a phytochemically depleted diet. Okay? By the way, where do all alcoholic beverages come from? Yeah, plant foods, right? Come from plants. So do you think when you ferment the plant that all the good things vanish? Is there still resveratrol in wine? Are there still constituents from the phytochemicals from the hops in the beer? Yes. Now, of course, the more you distill it, the less phytochemicals you have. But the point is, there's still good things that the Creator put in plants that are still in the alcoholic beverages. And my best way of synthesizing the literature is that, yes, if you're on a phytochemically depleted diet, there might be some things that you're missing that you're getting in your red wine. But if someone comes to me and tells me, well, I drink alcohol for my heart's sake, I say my response should be, whether this is the most discreet thing to say or not, my response probably should be something like, well, I'm so sorry to hear you're on such a bad lifestyle that you need the red wine. Okay? Because really, if they're on a good lifestyle, they don't need it. And of course, if we're talking about comprehensive lifestyle, this is just some more data from EPIC, but there's multiple studies that look at this. But if we're talking about hemorrheology in the context of cancer, I mean, clearly the data is so compelling with alcohol, even moderate, small amounts of alcohol. I mean, this is a statement from that particular study. The cancer risk increases with every drink, so even moderate amounts of alcohol, such as a small drink each day, increases the risk of these cancers. They're speaking of multiple cancer sites. And Here's another summary statement. Alcohol consumption should not be recommended to prevent cardiovascular disease or all-cause mortality because cumulatively it's not beneficial. So what about a healthy beverage? How about juicing? How should we regard that? So what do I have? All of 2 minutes left? Am I keeping track here correctly? When does this presentation finish? Okay. So we'll talk about this when we. So basically, we'll continue this on Sunday. So we're trying to look at practical things, different things. But are there any burning questions from what I've touched on at this point as we wind up? Okay.
When you were talking about the water, what do you think about carbonated beverages that are like water only, like LaCroix?
Yeah. I have not looked at that question in quite a while, but when I last looked at it, I thought it was a minor concern. Okay. Roger, do you know any more about that? Yeah. When I last, and here's the thing. This is the challenging thing. The challenging thing for us as health educators is how do we give a compelling message, an accurate message, without making the message so narrow that no one can embrace it. And we have to be careful, I think, that we don't make it too narrow. I know when we have done events in Europe, many of the Europeans are much more into the carbonated beverages than we are here, and it often is just. In fact, my wife's relatives are from Norway, and I remember we were over at the home once of one of her Danish relatives, and he has a device that puts carbonation into the water. So, and I know some people have raised concerns about bone health and other things, but in the research I did some years ago, I couldn't find enough to get me, really worried. But again, I wouldn't take that to the bank. Yeah, it's still. I'm still sure there's a lot of stuff that's come out since then. Other questions?
Talking about caffeine, what about some of the research about green tea is beneficial? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let's put it this way. There are even, I don't know if Dr. Schwelt will talk about this. Are you going to talk about some of the healthy constituents in animal products? Okay. There are some healthy constituents, and there's healthy constituents in tobacco smoke. Did you know this? Now, some of you are looking at me, perplexed. But tobacco smoking is protective of ulcerative colitis. Are you not aware of that? But it's a risk factor for a inflammatory bowel disease that affects more of the gut, which is Crohn's disease. Okay? So the cumulative, why I'm answering the question this way, is because there can be good qualities, there can be even healthful constituents in even things that cumulatively are harmful. So let's talk about green tea. There actually is a constituent in green tea called ECGC, epigallocatechin gallate, that we've actually used in a few cases in patients with cancer, certain hemopoietic cancers. And I think it's Johns Hopkins that did some research on this. So there is that compound. And there's other phytochemicals in green tea that may have beneficial properties. This EGCG also seems to be a heavy metal chelator. So we alluded a little bit to iron and some of iron's potential toxicity if we have it in excess. Iron is a pro-oxidant, so are other heavy metals. And there are some natural antioxidants. Turmeric has natural chelators in turmeric. Natural chelators in quercetin is one of the natural chelator. I know Dr. Schwelt has talked a fair amount about quercetin and COVID-19. I didn't create that memory, did I? Okay. So he's saying that is true. But quercetin also has these heavy metal chelating properties, so does EGCG. So here's where I'm going with all this. So if someone switched from coffee to green tea, would that be moving in the right direction? Probably. But I know our time is slipping away, but I don't see anyone rushing up yet to take the mic from me. So let me tell you, my biggest concern with caffeine is not the direct hemorheologic effects, it's actually the moral effects. And very interesting study done probably a decade ago. The headlines, I can get you the reference if you want. The headlines of the when the lay press picked it up, want to live longer, ? Drink coffee. Published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I went and I hadn't seen the study. They came out, so I went and got a hold of the study, and I started reading through the data. And you get down to the results, and they have this statement. Something like there was a linear relationship between caffeine consumption and mortality, a direct linear, coffee drinking. In other words, the more coffee they drank, the sooner they died. Say, wait a minute, what was the conclusion of the study? You want to live longer, drink coffee. I'm thinking, wait, the raw data showed the exact opposite of what the conclusion of the press was. Let's start reading through it some more. And what the researchers did was they're going to control for every other factor. So you can just isolate the effect of the coffee, right? It's very interesting. They found basically that coffee intake was associated with every other bad habit It was associated with cigarette smoking, weight gain, lack of activity, poor diet. Now, if caffeine, this is a coffee study, I'm extrapolating a bit, but if caffeine has moral effects, if it affects our behavior, if it affects our judgment, if, as I've heard this attributed to Pavlov, so if any of you speak Russian, you can check the original literature, see if this is really Pavlovian, if you will. Supposedly Pavlov called caffeine bad habit glue. So what would you expect to see if that's really true? What would you expect to see? You'd expect to see exactly what they published, that all the bad habits are connected with coffee intake. And so is it fair to, quote, adjust for all the bad things? I think it's very interesting because you read The Spirit of Prophecy, Ellen White's main burden about caffeine, caffeinated beverages, was not that it's going to cause you to die sooner, it's going to impair your circulation, you have heart attacks. What was she concerned about? She was concerned about the mental and the moral effects. So it's very interesting. So I'm not an advocate of any caffeinated beverages. It doesn't necessarily mean that the first visit I have with a patient, I'm going to take away all their caffeine. But so look at kind of these big picture issues. And I think we're getting some really great presentations. I've looked at my peers and what they're going to be talking about. So I'm excited as we continue to learn together as well as we continue to pray and study together. Thank you.